Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you especially, Tosin. When I came down into the lobby from the hotel this morning, someone looked at me and said, Tosin's mother. So thank you. Yeah, and it's fantastic to be here. Yeah. Where do we start? So, normally when I speak publicly, I do an incredible amount of preparation, partly because I'm terrified that I'll lose my train of thought. But actually for this conversation, I decided not to, because I wanted to be very present, thinking kind of on my feet as we go through it. So forgive me if it's a little disjointed. And I also hate talking to people behind me. So, I mean, I apologize for talking, but you can only see my back. But one of the key things that struck me was the word scarcity, which implies a lack of something. And I would like to start this discussion by saying, is it possible to reframe scarcity differently? That it is not about lack, it is rather about an abundance, maybe an abundance of ethics, an abundance of imagination, abundance of action. I'd like to start talking about that. Yeah. What do you think?
Absolutely. You want me to sort of begin to, okay.
Articulate scarcity for me, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're beginning to sort of point to that direction. There's a kind of, it's a relative metric and how we actually define it. But I also, as a practicing architect, am interested in what that means for images and the tyranny of images that come out of even establishing that as a metric. And I think that's highly problematic. I mean, I look at frugality and subsistence, and I find some of those are much more accurate ways of us picking up the problem. Scarcity is defined by the other sometimes,
yeah.
Right? And I think that's highly sort of problematic. I mean, in the same way as minimalism has become a style, and it goes away from the kind of values that come out of frugality. I mean, I look at the architecture of Mahatma Gandhi, for example, that he built. That was frugal, and it implied the aesthetics of minimalism, but it was actually frugal. And I mean, my own theory is that we embraced modernism in India at the independence with Nehru because it aligned with the minimalism that Gandhi sort of, by default, almost created as an aesthetic for our country. But that came out of frugality or subsistence. Those are more accurate descriptions of how we might deal with resources or even define the lack of resources and how we might create innovation as a result of that.
I mean, I think it was in Tosin's speech that you were talking about post-industrial revolution, and I kept thinking about that word, the industrial revolution, that somehow we understand it as a phrase, but we're not always cognizant of what it actually means, what it meant. And I kept thinking, is there another phrase that can define this moment? And the words, the ethical revolution, kept coming to me. And it is about, yes, frugality and scarcity and a kind of respect for resources. But it possibly is also a way to think about the world differently. And I realize that that's a very big statement. But what's amazing about this gathering, and I felt this almost immediately when I landed last night, that I was in another kind of space, another kind of world that is looking at the world differently. 5 or 10 years ago, I think it would have been hard to imagine this. Now it's here. What strength can we draw from platforms like this that actually force us to think about ourselves, our relationships to others, our relationship to the environment for sure, but also our relationship to language and to conceptual thinking, to epistemology. These seem to me to be at the heart of a gathering like this, which is not only about an exhibition and about the work of 59 or 29 plus writers participants, but actually it's about the whole world.
Yeah.
And that's not really a question. Sorry.
Yeah. In conversation with Lesley, she creates this wonderful blur between an architecture and a literature triennale and a poetry triennale. And, I just to respond to what you're saying, I think I always remember your definition of an architect, and you said someone who creates situations, right? And, it's so wonderful that you have picked this venue where this armature with immense possibilities sitting out here in I came to Dubai with coats and jackets because I thought I'd be in a convention center which was air conditioned at 20 degrees centigrade. So this is absolutely wonderful, and how one creates these situations, and I think it's here now because I think we are confronted now with a condition where we have to take, well, I don't even want to call them constraints, but we have to take these situations more seriously, and we've got to adapt ourselves to these conditions, innovatively. What necessity is the mother of invention, and I think you're absolutely right. We have to rephrase, reformat the situations we make, the habitat we make to live our lives, in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's a slightly tangent thought, but when I was quite small, I would say around 8, 9, clearly smaller than I am now, I used to wake up at night very frustrated because I couldn't think about things that were beyond my imagination. I remember being very obsessed with being able to think beyond what I already knew. And architecture is an incredible tool for doing exactly that. I mean, when we talk about the blurring of boundaries between architecture and art and film and literature and poetry, there's something about the training of an architect that is quite lateral and, I want to say, fluid, which is out of sync with what people think architecture is. We think of it as something very formal and stable. But there's something in thinking about scarcity, about resources, thank you,
thanks.
About ethics, about responsibility, about our behavior that requires a different way of understanding our place in the world. And if you can't think it, if you can't articulate it, you will never be it. Mm-hmm. And so for me, there's something very critical about thinking, I've got to cover my throat, through language here. Because I don't think we yet have the language to describe the world as we wish it to be.
Absolutely. And I think, you also bring up another thought that comes to mind, which is, and it's the provocation that you have for this triennale, which is the beauty of impermanence, because that throws time into this equation. And so do we have a scarcity of time? Are we running out of time, as is often phrased? And what that means, and I think what's interesting in the way you were describing your own memories as a child thinking into the future, is we are also trained to speculate and imagine the future. And I think what's happened in our world today, and this is all the kinds of thoughts that you alluded to, provoked, is that the future has become incredibly precise. We've been trained to speculate about the future because the future was always seen as being incredibly fluid. But now the future has become precise. We know in 8 years, 2 degrees, and what the implications are. And the past has become fluid. Everyone is reinventing the past, and we can see that in all the conflicts, we can see that in all the new narratives that are being developed. And in fact, it's turning pedagogy, it's turning our imagination and role as architects and designers on its back, because it's a complete flip. And it's all happened in the last decade, I would think. The politics show it, and the crisis show it, and therefore, are we running out of time? And so what does time mean in terms of scarcity? No.
It's a really provocative question for me. If I think about time in different scales, so I think about the time it takes to train an architect, the 5 years of thinking, making, testing, critiquing, thinking again. There's something about the scale of those 5 years that I think cannot be shortened. Is that okay? Yeah. It can't be shortened because actually it's a very, very complex thing. There's something about the time of action. I know I've been saying this a lot lately, but at the age of 60 now, I'm thinking more about the past 30 years than I am about the future 30 years, which has a definite effect on the way you teach, the way you think, the way you write, because you are conscious of time being finite in a way that 20 years ago I wasn't. But also that the increasing limits, and these are the limits that you're talking about, in 8 years we know that this is going to happen, in 2 degrees, etc. So there's a kind of pressure cooker outside that is so complex, it requires more time on the inside of teaching, the inside of pedagogy, and yet we seem to be running out of it. So I feel as if we're somehow in a race against something, and that race has also to do with us, how we understand. I mean, you put it so beautifully, the relationship between slavery, between colonialism, between exploitation, between conflict, between capitalism. These things are part of a same attitude. Now what we're talking about, I think, is developing a metric, a value system that both recognizes that, but can also do something about it. And I feel as if the past sort of 5-10 years have very much been about stating something, finding the confidence and the wherewithal and the resources to tell a different story. But telling the story is not enough. There's a new step now that has to be taken. And I'm looking to the generation behind for clues about how that happens.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I think the last 10 years that you described, and I mean, of course, this is also what you provoked us all to think about in the Biennale you curated and what this Triennale does. But what that results in a positive way, is this sort of, as I describe it, the exponential expansion of our sphere of concern. It's absolutely amazing when I talk to students. Their concerns are so complex, and they're just expanding really exponentially. I mean, climate change, one end of that spectrum. But what's also happening, and this is going to be, I think, the challenge for anyone involved with pedagogy, is your sphere of influence is diminishing, because we don't have the tools, we don't have the narratives, the words to precisely intervene where we could be instrumental. And so this sort of, how does one calibrate within these broader, more nuanced debates, a balance between our spheres of concern and our spheres of influence, and how we find the space, whether it's a discussion on social justice, climate, equity, how do we find those moments where we can intervene? And I think that's going to be a challenge for pedagogy. In fact, I think the question, again, as a provocation in the same way as you provoke us with impermanence, is should we be training another generation for certainty or for uncertainty? Architecture is premised on creating stability through material deployment, through imagery, and all of that. But maybe we need to be talking about uncertainty and flux and transitions and, you know, a whole other gamut of things. And that leads us to other words, perhaps.
I mean, I would say that having taught in many different places around the world, there is something very unique about teaching on the African continent. And I've spent the past sort of 5-8 years thinking about why that is. And I think it has something to do with the role of translation. I've said it many times, I don't think there's an African alive who doesn't speak more than one language, and that would probably be the same for this context here in the Middle East. The understanding that there are majority languages out there that are not your own, but that you are constantly what I call code shifting between one set of ideas and another, produces a kind of confidence about uncertainty that I think is evidenced in the work. I mean, I just went into the Sandra Paulson exhibition just behind us. It's the first one I've seen. And the conflation of smell, tectonics, the video screen, and artifact is exactly that ability to harness very disparate ideas, let me call them ideas, and somehow to make something both physical but also experiential out of it. That facility I have seen in this part of the world more than I have seen anywhere else. So to think about scarcity and lack and frugality, for me, they're not exactly the right words. Actually, there's an abundance of something here that I can't quite put my finger on, but when I see it, I recognize it, and it's all around. And I can't be more articulate than that.
No, absolutely. I mean, what you describe is also true for all of South Asia, for example, where I work. And I think what you're saying, or just to say it another way, is the ability to be using many languages gives you access to many cultural perspectives. And if culture are those implicit rules that exist in society, there's no handbook for culture. Language gives one an incredible access to rotate around the problem 360 degrees and see it from every perspective. And those perspectives could be subaltern perspectives, it could be elitist perspectives, but you're seeing it simultaneously. And then that becomes the challenge for architects, that synthesis. That is, how can one make all of those perspectives be on the same side of the table and not in opposing sort of views. And in fact, for me, when I hear a student say they're clear about something, I know they're confused. When someone's completely confused about a problem, I know they're thinking clearly, because this multiplicity and synthesizing that is what I think as educators, we have to find a way of giving students the confidence to synthesize. And that brings a richness, and it will result in the development of a new vocabulary, as you're sort of aspiring or alluding to.
Yeah, it's such a great point. I mean, I, probably like many, I went into architecture longing for stability. I wanted to know a lot about one thing. I thought it was something that studying literature or art wouldn't give me. There was some attraction to architecture as something very, very certain. 7 years later, I think I knew less than when I started. And so there was something about the inability to grasp architecture that kept me interested, and I know this is the same for students, that tantalizing goal of understanding things is just always slipping away. And yet, curiously, the training that you go through, the ability to be confident in those tools, to be secure in uncertainty, is the most powerful thing for the 22nd century. I was watching Christine Amanpour and Yuval Hariri on CNN. There's a little clip talking about Palestine maybe about a week ago. And one of the points that Christine was asking him was, as somebody who deals with complexity, is it possible to hold more than one thought, one view at the same time? And his response was that actually that is the condition of our times, that it is possible to be perpetrator and victim in different times, but also simultaneously. And actually the way we think about the world doesn't allow for that ambiguity. We are either this or that, the kind of binary thinking, which is where we are. And curiously, architecture sets out as a kind of binary, inside, outside structure, landscape. It's full of those. And in the end, it's not about any of that at all. And somehow the tools to understand that have to come from outside architecture. And that's always been a conundrum.
No, absolutely. And I think, but what you're describing, and I know there are sessions that are going to discuss this, is very much a Western canon of that binary of the building as this kind of autonomous object. I mean, in this part of the world, going down to Asia, that fluidity, that ambiguity, that transient kind of nature is cultural. It's just that we've forgotten that because we've made architecture into a binary. And I think what has sort of accelerated that process is the binary between the hard city and the soft city. So it's for me, it's ironical that the biggest sort of entrepreneurs of the digital world live in Mac mansions that look like last century buildings, right? Is that because of stability, as you're alluding to? There's something amiss here, because the way the digital world or the soft city, whether it's culture, whether it's cultural practices, whether it's the way we communicate and construct culture through digital practices is it's so nimble, it's so adaptable, it's so invisible, it's so ambiguous, it's clear and confusing at the same time. But architecture is aspiring consistently for a kind of clarity to dissipate ambiguity and to create an immovable object. And that's why impermanence is an incredibly important provocation. I mean, are we making permanent solutions for temporary problems? I mean, that should become almost a starting point. I mean, just look at this adaptability. It's just so beautiful. I mean, this could have been a tensile structure that's removed in the evening and the courtyard cools. I mean, that's what the Mughals did in India with their architecture. And so how do we not make this, the permanent and the impermanent, again, another binary, but begin to have these binaries now work together to dissolve completely, right? I mean, I think that should be our aspiration, and what that means for education, the vocabulary you're alluding to, is a really interesting challenge.
No, and I think it's one of the reasons, or one of the many reasons, why fora and platforms like this are so important, because I think if you were to look at the conventional training of an architect pretty much the world over, and I can certainly say this about my continent, it doesn't differ that much from the global north. I mean, in some ways, we certainly in West Africa have a curriculum that the Europeans threw away 50 years ago, so we're still reliant on an imported understanding. But what I've seen in the past, probably decade, is this increasing confidence to narrate differently, which it already is in the process of transforming into canon, and that is, for me, goosebump. This is like a goosebump moment, where it's not just one show, one book, one practitioner. Actually, there's a movement now, and I'm seeing it everywhere, which is both exhilarating and slightly unnerving, because the speed with which new ideas are kind of transmitted is something that maybe 5-10 years ago couldn't have happened in quite the same way. But there's communities being made now between people here, between people on the continent, between people in the diaspora. There's a whole new vocabulary emerging, which I think it's both timely, but also so critical, yeah. Which again isn't really a question, yeah.
Yeah, I know you sort of in passing use the word global north, and I mean, I think that's another elephant in the room in a sense, the kind of binaries we construct out of that. And I think, as you were saying that, I was just sort of thinking, how else could one kind of develop those alternate binaries, or how you dissolve those binaries in a sense, because now in every city in the global north, there is a city of the global south present, and vice versa. I mean, even I see the contrast between Dubai and Sharjah is absolutely incredible. In fact, one even thinks of descriptions like the third world, which actually had amazing resonance, but it began to be used in the context of poverty, underdevelopment, but it was really trying to show the third way of how you could dissolve the binary between the first and the third and the second world. Foster Dulles' America and Stalin, and others, Lenin's, communism. But it got co-opted in another discourse. But these were early attempts to begin to create these dissolutions, and I think it's contingent upon us now to construct these frameworks which will be more productive for the future. I mean, not only for us as societies, but of course as an extension as practitioners.
Just when you said that, I was thinking, again, it's the pros and cons of language in a way. So as the words, third world, developing world, Arab world, Islamic world, all these worlds become part and parcel of everyday conversation, they begin to lose their specificity and they lose their meaning. They become meaningless and placeless. And so there's something about language's inability to fix, which architecture does do. It fixes. So somewhere between the boundarylessness of language and the real implications of form and place, the marriage between these two ideas, I think, is where architecture is going. And rather than this endless conversation that we have, particularly when talking about architecture from elsewhere, is it architecture, is it not architecture? If I have $1 for every time I've heard that, I could have retired 50 years ago. Rather than think about that as a binary, maybe we need to start thinking about it as some kind of hybrid that's also time-based, that something can be immaterial for a while. I mean, you talk about the beauty of impermanence, but maybe one of the ways to test it is by making it permanent.
No. I mean, I think, no, that's beautifully put. And again, just to kind of refer to the theme for the Triennale and the discussions we're going to have, that's absolutely right. And that's where I think the value of bringing thinking around impermanence is critical. And, none of us are asking for everything to become impermanent, but we are asking for the notion of impermanence to be used instrumentally, strategically, to allow what you're describing, the transitions, right? I mean, as architects and, well, as society, we tend to think in terms of absolute solutions, right? I mean, we are trained to do that. Modernism was one extreme there. But can we think more in terms of transitions? And that's where I think thinking about impermanence, reversibility, adaptability, or these sorts of rubrics can help us make those transitions. Because finally, and this is where architecture persists and often sends out incorrect signals, because, identity is being formed as we speak, and architecture locks it into a moment, and then we kind of get stuck and have to respond to it. Culture is not a category that you excavate or discern. Culture is also being constructed. Those are the implicit rules as society. That's why they say you have to live in Dubai for 3 years to understand its culture. It's not a handbook that's given to you by someone in the tourism department, right? But architecture keeps fixing this without allowing that transfer, and that's where we get conflicted, where for example, only because I work in India, India's identity at the time of our independence through the aesthetics that Gandhi brought was the Indian identity. I mean, I couldn't say that for today's India. It's changed dramatically. But we allude to some of that, and that's incorrect. And so how we calibrate architecture on this spectrum of what is permanent. Of course we need permanence, and what is reversible, impermanent, seen in time frames which are different. Why don't we in our schools ask the second year students to design a weekend home for a family that's going to last only for 20 years? We never do that. Everyone's coming up with absolute solutions to a given problem, and that's the shift that I think we could make. So there's space. I mean, the farmer's market, big phenomena, by default does that. It says, okay, parking lots can be used to sell good organic vegetables for a few days in the week. That's an example. We've sort of forgotten that way of thinking because absolutism is how our societies politically, economically, through capitalism and other forms have led us to. And this is counter to what our role and what values we can bring as architects and design. And that's the conflict that we're all struggling with. I mean, telling different stories, finding ways to open up other ways of doing. And I think, therefore, impermanence as a provocation can be very strategic in that conversation.
I mean, one of the most powerful briefs I ever came across was the brief for the airport for Mandela's death. And someone I knew had worked on this project, and it was a bona fide brief, and it was for a runway that could accommodate Air Force One, but only once. So this project was planning for an event that everybody knew would be hugely significant. So it had all of the kind of armature of something phenomenally permanent, but it would only be there for this one event. And I think that the way we teach, and it's partly, yes, because I am an educator, but for me, everything begins in the classroom. If we want to change the way we think, that's the battleground, that's the kind of testing ground. And in some senses, there's no better example than this. If we are really to take the question of ethics seriously, there is an ethical dimension to education that we are not getting, I think. And for me, I don't know if poetic justice is exactly the right word, but it's amazing that the provocation for thinking differently has come from regions that were never expected to think differently. That for me, is where I could hang up my hat. So proud of this. Yeah.
No, you just make me think of something which I've quoted often, but talking about poetics and poetic justice, one of the things we did, as you know, studied this temporary city that happens in India. It happens once in 12 years. It houses 7 million people. It lasts only for 55 days. And so I took my students and we spent time there because we thought we'd be inspired in the way we can look at temporary settlements. And, there were some priests who helped us. And on the last day, just before we were leaving, I went to this high priestess and I thanked her and I told her how much we'd learned about infrastructure and temporary governance and how this would be very useful when we look at refugee camps and this, that, and the other. And this city happens on the banks of the Ganges. And she listened to me and looked at me really weirdly when I was talking about infrastructure and roads and tents and temporary. And she just looked at me and said, just be blessed that the mother Ganges let you sit in her lap for a few days, because we had lived in that city for a few days. It took the whole conversation to another level because it had encompassed in it thinking about impermanence, thinking about spirituality, interconnectedness, and all the things that I think we have to urgently open up the debate to. And so, it made me think about exactly what you're saying, Lesley, which is these need completely different starting points in terms of formulation. Otherwise, if our starting points are the same, it's like asking the wrong question.
And I mean, there is a question also around resources, and having just come out of the Biennale experience. On the one hand, the ideas I think have always been there. The talent, for me, has always been there. The mechanisms of bringing that talent to the world, and this is the stuff that happens in the hinterland of all the Triennale and the Biennale that, many of us don't see. But the financial structures that allow this to happen, the administrative, logistical structures, those things, in some senses, are the unsung heroes of moments like this, because without that investment, and I mean it investment in the most basic, pragmatic sense, none of these conversations can take place. And there is something about the courage it takes to marshal the resources to say something differently that I really do want to applaud. That is the platform on which this generation and the next will stand. So there is an enormous pressure on events like this to be, in inverted commas, successful, to be saying something. But the pressure is there because it is so important. Without these platforms, nothing changes. Yeah.
No, very much. And I think just as an extension of that thought, what formats like this, and exhibitions in particular, the Triennales and the Biennales, for all the kind of discourse around their relevance in today's world with social media, their value lies in the fact that multiple media can play itself out, which means you begin to have collisions between different forms of expression that come from different cultural practices. And therefore you become aware, like going into that room, we suddenly felt transported just because of the smells that sort of encompassed us. And I miss the circus, which growing up was a big deal for us in a place like Mumbai or Bombay then. But besides the cruelty to animals, which I don't support, but what was wonderful about the circus is that it camped on an open space and people went to it, and poor children became aware of rich children across the ring. You became aware of the diversity that made up your city because everyone came to see this thing. And I think events like this do that. It creates forms of awareness, not only in terms of different cultural expressions, but also issues that you don't see as being important that suddenly surface and take on a scale that makes you sit up and actually informs what you're thinking about too.
You made the point earlier that culture is always a work in progress. It's not something that there's no handbook for it. Nobody tells you what it is. You form it. You kind of make the road as you walk it. And I would say that my awareness of how we construct canon over the last 10 years has radically changed. I think when I came into architecture, I thought I was coming in as a passive recipient of canon. Now I understand it completely differently, that we are all, in small ways, large ways, responsible for its making. And the platforms that allow us to challenge what we think, to see things that we hadn't considered, to even be corrected in our approach, these things are phenomenally important. So this is to say that there's a question about the relevance of biennales and triennales and exhibitions. I think they're fundamental. They're the lifeblood of forming new canon.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I just go back to Tosin, she had used the word values, and and that's sort of linked to identity construction, what you're sort of talking about, because actually identity is something we construct. It's not an excavated category. We construct it through what we identify with, and that's where values come in. It drives me crazy in the US when I present my work in India. I'll have people come up and ask me, but what is Indian about your work? And first of all, I never see that being asked of an American architect when they present. No one says, what's American about your work? But I'm asked that, or you'd be asked that about African. And then it makes me think that actually aesthetics can be problematic. You listen to the values I'm bringing to this, whether it's frugality, scarcity, innovation, and how I'm responding to resources. That's what gives then my work identity. It's not the aesthetics. Mark Angeli, who's a friend of many of us here, told me how they went to Addis Ababa to study informal settlements, and they spent the 10 days, they spent 8 days measure drawing, photographing the informal settlement. It was outside Addis Ababa. Anthropologists would have done the other thing. They would have spent 8 days interviewing people and 2 days photographing it. But the architects spent 8 days measuring and photographing it, and then they kept the last day for interviews. And in their first interview, they learned it wasn't an informal settlement. It was a government settlement. It just looked like an informal settlement, right? And so the aesthetics of we have to think beyond aesthetics. Aesthetics has become a huge baggage, whether it's minimalism and whether it's modernism has become a style, sans its social agenda, and this is highly problematic. And I think the notion of impermanence also unsettles that, because you don't know quite what the aesthetics of impermanence is. And I think it could be productive to even bring that dimension to the debate, because that's what we are trained in and what we talk to our students about.
I mean, when I think back to my time as a student, and this is a very poignant moment because the person who taught me passed away last Wednesday. But one of the things that was very meaningful about the relationship I had with Jonathan Hill was that he allowed me, and I mean that in the deepest sense of the word, as the relationship between a student and a tutor, to go wherever my imagination would take me. So to be critical about aesthetics, to be critical about language, to be thoughtful about form. And there was some freedom that was absolutely instrumental in allowing me to formulate my own practice. And so aesthetics, for me, was never a barrier. Actually, it was like the sea. You could dive into it and go where you wanted. And I think increasingly we are being channeled towards a particular kind of aesthetic, which is the problem. It is not aesthetics in general, it's the kind of aesthetics. And I also wanted to say, do we have time for Q&A? Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
One point to what you've just said, which is, I think, just to extend what Lesley said, is, it often occurs to me, and I absolutely agree with you, aesthetics is something we swim in. And I think one way to reformulate this conversation for us in the academy, there's a lot of emphasis in the way we talk about the practice of architecture. If you flip that and you ask, what is the architecture of practice? It completely changes things, because I think the only metric that we should be judging architecture by is not aesthetics, it's not how architecture's practice, but how we engage. And for that, the architecture practice, models of engagement, models of practice, I think we have to take the conversation there. And the multiplicity there that will emerge would be tremendous. And that will allow different voices to find their agents for transformation. Yeah.
Do we have any questions? Any comments? Just here.
Hello, thank you for this really engaging conversation. I'm speaking as the head of School of Architecture at the University of Liverpool. I think the ideas that you have brought out are so true in terms of architectural education. This has been the moment where we can begin to interrogate how we teach and indeed what this canon has been that has come from, let's say, somewhere else, global. But importantly as well, I think our younger architectural colleagues and students, it is in their gift to start to really work and run with this. And I actually think about a thing that my father, who was a surgeon, said, which is architecture is like frozen music. And that's the thing, music continues, and in some ways maybe it is this fixity that we are preoccupied, particularly from a Western perspective, that is something we should be challenging. Certainly, we know anthropologically that we use space, or a lot of the global South, and I will use that word, uses space very differently. But we are being, or we have been, in terms of our education, and Lesley and I are just about the same age, so even in places like West Africa, who effectively our ideas were at the table as anthropology, but not as architecture. And now is the time where I think what's really interesting, now I've had time to be in the wonderful United Arab Emirates, we have to look at how space is used and how the tradition versus what the ambition is need to have that interaction. So this idea about this space here and how we use it, we don't need to be in an air-conditioned box. And this is actually traditional. It's nothing new, although in certain circles it's like climate change happened today. This is what we need to look at. There are really interesting ideas here, and educationally we have this chance through exhibitions and so on to begin to have this discussion. So thank you very much for the conversation. I guess it's more of a comment and commentary.
I mean, to your point, I also want to highlight in a way that actually those conversations are happening. I mean, there's a lot of talk in my generation, certainly, that, oh, now the baton has been, you know, it's going to be passed and people are going to pick it up. Actually, they've already picked it up. Yeah, it's amazing.
If there are other questions there.
You go and then it's a gentleman over there.
So I start first. Okay. Thank you so much for the lovely conversations, and I also want to thank the opening keynotes for acknowledging the conditions that we're living in now. So I speak as an independent practitioner from, I would say, a newer generation, and also as a current graduate student at Yale. And I have a question about complicities and preconditions for the practice of architecture. In architecture school, for as much as we are taught and encouraged to pursue an independence and ethics of care, certainly sometimes, there's the elephant in the room of the client, of who are you designing it for, how are you designing it, and where is it going to go to in the end, who pays for the concrete to be poured. And I guess my question really comes as a reflection of what kind of agency can architects and other spatial practitioners embrace and advance? What kind of autonomy is available to us outside of whoever is paying for it? Thank you.
Yeah, I can take it. No, that's a... No, thank you. That's a great question. I don't teach in an architecture school. I teach in an urban planning department because I felt you've got to look at cities too. But I think your question is a really pertinent one. And the way I kind of respond to it, or at least I think about it, is I think one something that we haven't done as a profession is actually have enough of a discussion about nuancing what we mean by the client, which is the question that you've asked, right? And it's also linked to what I was saying earlier. The only metric now we should apply in judging architecture is the mode of engagement, not the aesthetic, not the final product even, because what does that mean, right? So if you, just for simplicity, if I say the client, I'm just breaking the client into three parts, because the client can be the planet too, right? And that could be a baggage we can carry and not be able to respond. But for a minute, if you just nuance the client into a patron client, into an operational client, and into a user client, you already begin to have space where you can be instrumental in getting them on the same side of the table. Why architects love and celebrate single-family homes? Because that client, the complexity of the client collapses into one entity, and it's a sure shot. But if you look at an institution or a campus, the patron client is the president of the university, the visionary, the one with the bucks. The operational client is the campus engineer, and the user clients are the faculty and students. We tend to align with one of them, and that's the mistake. The moment you begin to see your client in a nuanced way, you'll find many more moments of intervention where you can begin to create agency for yourself, which you otherwise don't. Otherwise, you become complicit in an act that you don't morally feel comfortable in. So I think the first step there is to nuance our understanding of the client. And like I said, you can take it to the planet. You can become an advocate for X, Y, and Z, which impacts the whole neighborhood, the city, the planet. And so I think that nuancing, again, to go to Lesley's points, these are the vocabularies we have to develop. These are the shifts we have to make. And we have to make them the business as usual conversations, not the ones that we do in a forum like this.
I'll just say something very, very quick to that and then come to you, sir. I mean, it's also to say that we are all, even those of us here in this hall, we are also constructing the world of clients for ourselves. There are many people here who are not, in inverted commas, practicing architects, but who have responsibility for commissioning architecture. So the way in which you educate, and I don't mean educate in the formal sense, but broaden the conversation, is as important for the wider society, because that's where your clients will come from, as they are for the architects, ourselves. Sir, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm architect Haidar Ali from Sudan, coming out from the devastated, deconstructed city of Khartoum, unfortunately. But the very inspiring topic you are talking about here, I just want to ask, how can we move forward from this? Because I do recall, Rahul, your presentation in Durban 2014. It was very inspiring. I used to be the vice president of UIA at that time. And about that guardhouse in the terminal in Delhi. But where are we going? And also, I've been just to the Biennale in Venice. And the education of architecture is getting a big problem. Because with the digital architecture now, the students, they think what they are having, see these forms and these outstanding glass works of so-called star architects, is getting in the veins of the architects. Very unfortunate. I used to go to the university as external examiner, and then when I had a tour, very unfortunate, I have to say this, but what I have seen out of, the majority was lady architects or girls, and I just asked the supervisor, what is going on here? Sorry to say that, has Zaha Hadid come around or what? Because the inspiration is getting the architects, the young architects especially, far away from what we have. And when they graduate and come to our offices, it takes us almost 10 months or a year to get them down to the board of what they have around. They construct or design a house in Khartoum like a house in California. So what can we do? We just come and talk of responsible architecture and natural architecture, and this, even in Venice, we have some lectures like that. Where are we going? Shall we still talking of like this gathering? Thank you for it. But where are we going? Thank you.
Do you want to take that? I can do it. Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I have to say I disagree. I think that the avenue that other media have given people who previously would never have had an arena may not be evident now. And I'm not talking about the people who replicate, star architects. I'm talking about people who are using digital language, other means of expressing something that doesn't yet have form is really important. I think if you continuously do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, the society eventually will go mad. I think we're in a very, very interesting moment where the means, the tools at our disposal to think differently are here. Our contexts haven't yet caught up with them. But for me, it's not a reason not to push thinking in new directions, because if we don't, in 50 years' time, we will still be copying housing that we see in California. And that, for me, is the issue, not the engagement with reality, because I think actually part of what architecture does is try to change reality. And it's a long, long-term game. I think over the last 10 years, my favorite expression has been 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. But at least it's 2 steps forward. Yeah.
No, and reality is a question of perspective, right? The past seems clearer, the present seems incredible, and I think, you're absolutely right. But just 2 other quick responses to what you said, and the earlier comment about fixity. Actually, the problem is, of course, architecture is about place and context, but I think also we have to remind ourselves, which is, I think, what you're alluding to, is that architecture is not a movable feast. Music is a movable feast, architecture is not, and it has become too much of a movable feast because of the kind of tyranny of images that generated. But I think also to go to the idea, Lesley, that you've put on the table, which is how do we form these new vocabularies, how do we change thinking? It's already happening with now the interest in repair, the preciousness of conservation and only discerning cultural significance has now been expanded as we begin to see debates about repair. And that expands the role of architects. The amount of repair that we have to do to our cities and our societies in different ways, and there are many colleagues here who are better equipped to talk about this than me, is amazing. We need to take the debates in those directions. In fact, one of the things that has been a dream for me, and I speak to my colleague Ken Stewart, who is in charge of this, is, at some place like the GSD or Columbia at Yale, we should call the 20 top architects, and the brief should be, talk about a project that completely failed. Don't show us the projects that glisten. Show us a project that failed, and kind of get under the belly of that, right? That kind of demystification of the practice gets us closer to the reality you're talking about, because that creates feedback loops that by just being awed by something doesn't. You go away just awestruck, and for students, I don't think that's a good thing.
I'm reminded of a workshop that was held in Kigali about 4 or 5 years ago. And there were students from the University of Cape Town who came and met with the students and the university in Kigali is very new. And what was so interesting was that the Cape Townian students spoke for and on behalf of everybody, and the Rwandan students just kept quiet. That, for me, is the tragedy. And if the only way you can instill the confidence in those students to speak up is by taking them around on a detour, I'm all for that journey, because I'm so tired of that conversation where people speak on behalf of. Yeah. Any other?
Thank you very much.
One here, one there.
Yeah. I'm Dr. Shahamal Alloush. I'm Syrian by origin, but I teach at Sultan Qaboos University in the nearby Muscat, which is actually quite conservative culture. Architecture is about intellectuality. It's a product of intellectuality. And the last couple of decades, it's become like a product of visuality and technology. The beauty of this event is that bring back the architecture to its track. It's about intellectual interaction. I pretty much appreciate the many ideas that you discussed in your discussion. And in particular, you mentioned that culture has no handbook, which is quite agreeable and appreciable. Culture has to be felt, digested, experienced in order to be understood. Once it's understood, it can be used as a source for development. However, now I'm coming to my question. Nowadays, we are, as educators, not the only source for education to our, not only students, but also our children. Now, students are getting learned from many other sources that's out of our control/knowledge. AI broadened the horizon even farther. So when we discuss about with the student about culture and architectural locality, they look at the issue from, I would say, like you're an old-fashioned, you're not coping with what's going on in the world, which we might disagree with, but actually this is what they think of. Don't you think that we need to balance it out, as you correctly said for other topics? This has not to be bipolar also, it has to be scale. I mean, we should also understand the new generation inspiration and build upon that as opposite to leaving them felt that their inspiration is neglected. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a reality, and I know at every university how we deal with plagiarism through ChatGPT, all of that is center stage to the discussion. But I don't think that's the solution to police any of that. I think it's contingent on us in the academy as teachers to find new ways to cultivate, let's say, judgment. And how do you cultivate judgment? Because then that's beyond information. Information, I think we are actually, as pedagogues, 20 years behind. That information was already available with the internet, and we were inventing software to catch plagiarism. Ridiculous. We have to move into other formats that begin to cultivate judgment. That's where values become important, because that, I think we could stay slightly ahead of AI on that, I hope. But I think it is about formulating the problems, and that's what I said when I said in today's world, if you're confused, it means you're thinking clearly. And I think we have to have students who come out confused, because then they have to depend on others to collaborate. And unless we create those frameworks or armatures for collaboration, we are not going to make good practitioners for the future with the right values. And this is where we can beat the anxiety of technology that you're alluding to.
It's a great question. I mean, I've always believed that my job was to teach someone how to think, not what to think. Yeah.
Hi. Firstly, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I think the thing that really struck me about the conversation, and it's something that I'm constantly dealing with, is this thing about language. And obviously I'm Yoruba, I come from the southwest region of Nigeria. And I'm always wondering about what is the language of engagement, because it's so different from region to region, and how that language, or the understanding of language and the meaning behind phrases and proverbs, and how that's so essential to how you think about architecture. And I'm really curious about what it means going forward as practitioners of architecture. What language, how do you think about language in the way that you think about design, and how you think about how you engage with people? I think for us, working in Sharjah and doing an installation here, that is also something that has become very, very real, even though where our installation is based in the industrial district, it's a lot of migrant workers there from Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc. And coming from Lagos as well, and being Yoruba, and kind of thinking about architecture, in a language, Ayo and I were just talking about how in Yoruba is like Eku Dide, Eku Joko. There's like, everything you do, there is a kind of associated blessing to it. And how, in thinking about my Western architectural education, how language, I guess my language is sort of eradicated from that, and how so much of people's languages are eradicated from how they think about architecture, and how do we think about rebalancing that?
It's a great question. I mean, my father was a surgeon, not interested in architecture remotely. And when I built my own house in Ghana, which just had one room, he was really disappointed. He thought I would build something much grander. And I remember standing in the living room slash bedroom slash kitchen. It's one space. And he said, you know, in Ghana, we spend a lot of time greeting each other. Like the greeting is the most important moment. And he said, when he first went to the UK and he understood the purpose of a hallway was the place where the outside world came in, did their greetings, and then went into the living room, he made the comment that actually in Ghana, the hallway should be the biggest space in the house because that's where all of the greetings took place. And it was a really interesting direct translation of a ritual and a practice and a language that we hadn't found an architecture form for. So rather than have the bedroom as the place that you sleep and the kitchen as the place that you cook and the living room as the place that you live, there would be a different way of thinking about those spaces. And that's what I think architecture does that no other discipline that I know of, and it's not that I've studied that many, but it allows us to take language and translate it into something else. It retains the roots of language, but it also becomes something else. And I think that the journey that everybody here is on is figuring out what that else is. Some people have found it. I mean, if I think back to that space there, dust, smell, image, form. Others are on that journey towards it. The most important thing is that actually we're engaged in making it. And I think you're absolutely right. If you come from other language sources, your ability to translate and to draw form is different. We just don't know how to teach that yet, I think. Yeah.
No, that's a really interesting question. And I mean, partly as cautionary, I think we've also, whether it's fixity and the local, we have to also be careful how we, in this world today, create a balance between what might be specific to a language, to a place, but also how we work as a global community. And so I think one can differentiate that very interestingly. I was just sort of listening to Lesley and thinking about, you know, the notion of privacy gradient. Now, that differs in every culture. If we can make students aware of a category like that, which is a nuancing of how people might embrace the public, private, the hallway, where, you know, in the colonial bungalow, it was one kind of privacy gradient. In the traditional Indian house, it's a different kind of privacy gradient. Then they become conceptual categories that one can localize to a culture and yet interpret in completely different ways, right? Similarly, dwelling is a much more robust category than housing. Housing becomes units and then we multiply and aggregate it into housing projects, right? But if you look at dwelling, I can be empathetic to someone dwelling on the sidewalk, but I can also be empathetic to someone dwelling in a fancy weekend home, right? I look at it as a different category. But then there are some things that are very specific to language. And one that I deal with in, say, my conservation practice, you know, is the word kal. In India, kal means tomorrow and yesterday, depends on the context how you use it. And in a society like that, with notions of cyclic time, the language tells you what you conserve and what you don't conserve. The ephemeral becomes a very big part of that cultural practice. And so you can then nuance it. It opens up a whole different world for you if you use these words carefully. But I mean, my caution is that I think those words can also teach the world. And therefore it's contingent upon us to create new platforms, new frameworks and theoretical frameworks that could benefit us even globally. Yeah.
No, I think what you're talking about is, or what you're talking about, Rahul, is also about interpretation. And interpretation is different. I mean, there's a nuance between that and translation. There's a nuance between that and articulation. So again, it comes back to the idea that, you know, the complexity of language actually allows us to have that complexity of thought. And it differs from language to language. The question maybe here is that how, by looking at things like scarcity, frugality, impermanence, we bring a richness to those ideas that is not about the lack of something, it's about the addition of something. I think we have room for one more, maybe? Yeah? Up there? Up there? At the top.
I have a question. Thank you so much for the conversation, Lesley and Rahul. My question is actually around the practice of impermanence. And if we continue to practice in that space of impermanence, what does that do to, or do we perpetuate the legacy of erasure through doing that? And what does it mean for the legacy we leave to future generations, I guess?
It's a great question. I suppose there's something on that spectrum between power and permanence that we do need to interrogate. To leave a legacy may not only mean to leave something tangible and permanent. And when we talk about reframing our value system, I think that question goes right to the heart of it. That in order to leave something permanent, there's a whole network of resources, of capital, of finance, of exploitation, of extraction that needs to support it. But if we thought about legacy differently, maybe we frame it not in terms of erasure or something not being there, but being there in a different way. And that's epistemological. I mean, that's I guess the end result of platforms like this is it's not only about the global south, it's not only about scarcity, it's actually about all of us, global north included, and global north more than anyone else. So I think that the idea that other parts of the world have different relationships to time, to permanence, to extraction is hugely important. And these platforms are part, I think, of the way of making that argument.
No, absolutely. Just to extend what Lesley said, and I think it's a great question, there are two ways of looking at it. One is that, for us as architects, is you begin to get into questions of material life cycles, for example. So what's wonderful about this space is clearly the material life cycle of this truss might be less than what we see here, and other worlds might inhabit this, and what might get left is a memory of a prefabricated school, which is a prototype for the region, right? That becomes memory. And conservation practice is about that, right? It's about consensus building, that what a community thinks is important to leave as a legacy. And that's what listing of buildings is about now. Of course, it gets into its own controversies, but that's it, right? So you can decide in terms of what values that we as a community can embark in. And then, of course, Rem Koolhaas, in his characteristic way in Contents, provokes us to think that the time between the object's life and the point of preserving it is diminishing, which means in the future, before a building is built, we'll decide whether it's going to be listed. And that will be based then on what that community invests in it in terms of legacy, but also as an extension, what material life cycles that we kind of put into the building, or what materials we put into the building with a longer life cycle. So you determine that before the building is built, which is an interesting sort of thought. And so I think as architects, we have two things to grapple with here when we deal with the architecture of impermanence. One is the notion of material life cycles, which is scientific and objective, and the other is the most subjective legacy question and values, and what consensus and how we build that consensus on what should be conserved. Yeah.
I mean, got one question there, but just to say, your question has also made me think about legacy as resistance, and it's something that I'm still thinking about, that if architecture is not seen as a tool of preservation, it also makes you vulnerable to influence in a way that I'm still thinking about. But great question.
That's really very important what you've said, because it's also then the question of forgetting. Memory is also forgetting, the other side of it. And I think if we look at the flux and the kinds of settlements, the movement of demographies, the disruptions and the destruction, and so how I think it's a complicated question which we'll have to grapple with going into the future. But that's a wonderful thought.
Hi. Thank you for a very, very rich and interesting discussion. It's really been an eye-opener, so thank you very much. My question is really, comes from me as an architect and an academic who moves between East and West, or between the global North and the global South. The question is, I don't see a problem within this amazing and rich context, which is obviously very well aware of what we mean by impermanence, what we mean by culture, what we mean by empowerment. My question is more about the global North, who probably still sees the global South as a passive subject in the sense that the South only reacts and they are the ones who produce architecture. Is there a hope within the global North that they would start seeing what you referred to as the third word, as the third way of architecture, and coming as a architect, but also as a tutor at a university? When would the time become that we stop teaching students that modernism is the way, modernism is the sign for modernity to discuss aesthetic, and we actually, that actual essence is really within the global South to learn from? Do we have hope? Or is colonialism really within the details, and certainly within the mental occupation is far more stronger than the physical one?
Great question, and I have to say, hand on my heart, I am hopeful. I think I've seen in the last 10 years, certainly, such a profound shift in the way, certainly, the students that I'm in contact with, the colleagues that I'm in contact with. It's an uncomfortable shift, but the shift is happening. I see it all around me. I think it's very difficult to be in education without hope. At a certain level, that optimism is the kind of bedrock. I think we are already doing that. I mean, what's happening in this room is doing that. Whether the global North, if there is such a thing, is ready to listen, I kind of have to say it's not my problem anymore. Yeah.
No, I totally second that, and I think it's a really interesting question. And just to comment on my own experiences or the way one thinks of this, I think one sort of aspect, again, in the academy, we need to, for our students, nuance is what context means in the same way as we nuance what the client means, because we have simplified context to the physicality, the tangibles, right? Some of us who are more ambitious, they excavate the histories on that ground. But, you know, if you place the context in its context, which is then geopolitical, which is ideological, we don't teach that enough, because it's that intersection where so for example, modernism that you're talking about, I mean, in part of the world I work, in Africa, the Middle East, aesthetic modernity arrived here before the modernization process, right? In Europe, it came out of, the aesthetics was a logical conclusion of a whole shift in society. And, you know, we're realizing that now, and I use emblematically the debates that India is completely engaged with, which is a destruction of our modern architecture. Great examples of modern architecture are being destroyed, whether it's Louis Kahn's IIM or the Charles Correa buildings, etc. And it's actually, it's a good moment to surface this conversation. What does that mean, and has it meant something? I'm not saying they shouldn't be preserved. They should also be remembered for their problems. But I think this is a good moment in the history of the profession, in our nations, to bring up this conversation, because that way, it definitely is not our problem. But saying that may not be enough for us. We've now to articulate why it's not our problem, and I think this is a good moment to do that.
Thank you very much, Lesley and Rahul. Thank you.